Chapter 9. On the Verge of the Unknown. The exaltation, indecision, and agony of mind experienced by Pearl for the last fortnight culminated in a general breakdown. Towards dawn of the next day, Amy, sleeping in the adjoining room, was roused from slumber by sounds of talking in Pearl's apartment. The walls of Tokyo houses are proverbially thin. Even those constructed on European principles, and as Pearl was talking loud, every word she said could easily be overheard. A short time sufficed to rouse Amy from her bed, and in a minute she was in the next room. There, to her horror, she found Pearl in night attire with wide-open staring eyes, her glorious hair streaming down her back, pacing frantically up and down the room, uttering muttered sounds and incoherent words and exclamations. Amy was genuinely terrified at the appearance of those wild eyes and flushed cheeks, at the smothered cries and the constant stream of senseless words. All her attempts to calm her cousin and to lead her back to bed proving fruitless, she lost no time in awakening the household, and ere long she was in the telephonic communication with both Mrs. Rawlinson and the nearest doctor. Before the arrival of these persons, Amy had, however, succeeded in persuading Pearl to return to bed, where, with the help of the terrified amas, and by holding her down by main force, she had so far managed to keep her. No prayers or entreaties, however, seemed to have the slightest effect on the distracted mind, or soothing movements to influence the restless body. It did not take long for the doctor to make his diagnosis. A sudden and acute attack of brain fever was the verdict. Mrs. Nugent must have passed through some great and unexpected shock or struggle to have undergone such a sudden and complete collapse, he gravely remarked. I must ask to be allowed to call in Dr. Takayama in consultation. I find it impossible to say how the malady may turn. And then followed days and nights, weeks of anxious watching. For long, not only Pearl's reason, but life itself was despaired of. Terrible was the consternation caused by this news among the many who loved and admired, and even those who at one time may have disliked and envied the beautiful Mrs. Nugent. Her magnificent hair was sacrificed. Amy wept hot tears as she watched the scissors performing their ruthless task. She gathered the thick masses up in her arms and, separating one glossy auburn lock from the rest, enclosed it in an envelope. The direction bore the name of Lord Martinworth, and on the note, paper that surrounded the tress, was scribbled these 5 words: She is very ill, dying. But that note was fated never to be forwarded to its destination. Amy's impulses, though generally erring on the side of generosity and good nature, were frequently, for this very reason, unwise. On the rare occasions, however, that she gave herself time to consider, she seldom did a foolish thing. A trifling incident prevented her sending the communication and its enclosure that day, and the next saw it safely committed to the recesses of a drawer, from which it was only extracted several months later, under circumstances that brought back many a vivid and painful memory. It is an ill wind that blows no one any good. Pearl's dangerous illness had at least one beneficial and unexpected result, that of proving the means of an ultimate meeting and a complete reconciliation between Amy and Ralph Nicholson. Not a day passed without the latter calling to inquire about Pearl. Amy, however, busy with her aunt in the sick room, had never chanced to see him, and it was only when Pearl's illness had lasted almost a month, and the doctors had lifted the awful weight from their minds by at last finding a slight improvement in her condition, that an encounter between the two at length took place. Mrs. Rawlinson had sent Amy out into the garden for a breath of fresh air, and the girl was seated under the shade of the great stone lantern by the side of the miniature lake, watching the goldfish darting in and out among the rocks, and pondering sadly over the distress and the gnawing anxiety of the past few weeks. Great tears were flowing down her cheeks, which were pale and drawn. She fixed her eyes on Fujiyama, hazy and indistinct in the afternoon sun, and she wondered mournfully whether poor Pearl would ever gaze at her beloved mountain again. There was one little fleecy cloud hovering over the summit. It was snowy white with a silver edge, and Amy found herself dreamily comparing this mystical, almost transparent cloud to Pearl's pure, unsullied soul. Her eyelids drooped. She wondered and wept no more, for Amy slept the sleep of utter exhaustion. It was fully an hour later when she opened her eyes to find Ralph Nicholson standing by her side. "Poor little thing," he said sorrowfully, as she started up from her chair. "How sad, how weary you look. Go to sleep again, I will leave you. But first tell me, how is she today?" Amy brushed away the tears that were still wet on her eyelids. "The doctors see a slight improvement," she replied. "The fever is, they say, a shade lower. But she seems no better to Auntie and myself." "Oh, Sir Ralph, I'm sure she will die. She cannot resist. It has been going on so long now. She is still delirious at times, and I know the fever is gradually but surely wearing her away." Ralph looked at the sweet face on which all the joy and sparkle had died out, and on which grief for the time being had made such havoc. And as he looked, he knew that he had never admired, that he had never loved Amy Mendovi as he admired and loved her today, in this soft and saddened mood. He sat down on the grass beside her chair and took her hand between his own. Amy did not withdraw it. "Amy, dear," he said very quietly, "I cannot tell you how unhappy I am. It is awful to me to see your grief, for, as you know it well, Amy, though you never would listen to me. I love you, and have loved you for long, darling. May I share your trouble with you, Amy? May I help you to bear it a little? Will you be kind to me? And, after my long waiting, give me the right to do this?" Amy never quite knew how it occurred, but shortly after this request, she found her head leaning on Ralph's shoulder, while that individual was busily employed in kissing away the tears. Tears, whether now of joy or of sorrow, it was somewhat difficult to tell. But Amy would not have been a woman, and certainly not Amy Mendovi, if before her lover left her that day she had not satisfied herself as to the future disposal of the lady whom she chose to consider as her rival. "And Lady Martinworth," she inquired, "what are you going to do about her? You will, I suppose, be kind enough to stop going about with her and flirting, now that you have at last made up your mind to be engaged to me? Oh, Ralph, you don't care for her really, do you?" Ralph laughed and twirled his black moustache as he looked down into the flushed face. "Nobody," he replied, "has ever yet accused me of ingratitude. I certainly have no intention of casting off Lady Martinworth, for she has done me an uncommonly good turn." "What do you mean?" inquired Amy, on the defensive at once. "Simply that my flirtation, not that it deserves such a name, for Lady Martinworth, let me tell you, darling, hasn't got the remotest notion as to what flirting means. Our late intercourse was nothing more nor less than a pre-arranged plan formed with Mrs. Nugent to produce the desired result of bringing you, Miss Mendovi, to your senses. I couldn't have gotten much longer without you, you know. So we had to contrive some means by which you should learn to know your own mind. It was Mrs. Nugent's happy notion that I should try to make you jealous, Amy. She is ill now, so you must forgive her, you know. And as for me, I don't care if you forgive me or not, for now that you have once said yes, you won't find it very easy to get rid of me again. I can tell you that." Of course, Amy wasted a good deal of breath in pointing out that she had never for a single instant experienced the sentiment of jealousy, a sentiment for which, she assured him, she had indeed the very greatest contempt. She took some little trouble to explain that she had merely felt considerable regret that Ralph should have, caused gossip by allowing his name to be coupled with that of a married woman. In fact, she begged he would understand that her anxiety from the first had been solely for the condition of his morals, and she seized this opportunity to deliver quite an eloquent little homily on the iniquity of flirtations in general, and with married women in particular. To all of which words of wisdom Ralph listened attentively, the effect, however, being somewhat marred, in Amy's opinion, by a persistent and most apparent twinkle in the dark eyes. She inwardly wondered if he could by any possibility be laughing at her, and she felt that she really had some right to be aggrieved when, after her lecture, which had lasted fully 5 minutes, he merely said in reply that Lady Martinworth was a real good soul. And though he perfectly understood Amy being somewhat prejudiced against her for the moment, he had not the slightest doubt that eventually the two would become the closest of friends. "She is the kindest-hearted, straightest woman I know," he added, "and she really has an awfully sad life. Martinworth doesn't care 2 straws for her. He is away now, went off weeks ago, and never offered to take her with him. She is terribly lonely, for she knows very few people here. I think you might take pity on her, darling, and chum up a bit with her." Which tactless and unfortunate suggestion was met with the severity it deserved. Miss Mendovi regretted, but she really did not think that she and Lady Martinworth were likely to prove congenial. From her childhood, she had possessed a strong dislike for mannish women, and though of course she could not but feel sorry for the poor thing's solitude, she really feared that just at present, with her mind and hands so full of dear Pearl, she would have but little spare time to devote to outsiders. This fact reminded Amy that it was impossible to waste further precious moments in talking about a person who really interested her so very slightly, so that if Ralph would excuse her, she would go and relieve her aunt in the sick room. But Amy was not allowed to depart just yet. So Ralph was wise enough to see that he had, to use his own phraseology, put his foot into it, and he mentally decided that for the future, Lady Martinworth's name should figure as little as possible in his and Amy's conversations. He promptly made up for lost time, and when Amy parted from him a quarter of an hour later, the radiance of her face proved that, certainly for the time being, the fact that such an annoying person as Lady Martinworth existed was entirely obliterated from her mind. Meanwhile, Sir Ralph Nicholson had spoken the truth when he announced that the lady discussed was an unhappy woman, though perhaps he would have been more accurate if he had contented himself by saying that she was an intensely bored woman. She hated Tokyo, and for that reason alone, she had been somewhat disappointed when her husband had started on his travels without her. As for his indifference to her companionship, she was too much accustomed to that state of things to greatly worry herself on that score. It was only on very rare occasions, such as the day when she had unbosomed herself to Pearl, that she would allow the fact of her husband's want of affection to distress her. Harry Martinworth was essentially practical, and if only she had been able to indulge in some amusement more or less congenial to her tastes to occupy her spare time, she would certainly never have troubled herself about what, by bitter experience, she knew to be the inevitable. But here she was, planted down in a Tokyo hotel, with scarcely an acquaintance in the whole of Japan, save Sir Ralph and the members of the English legation. Art of any kind had no interest for her. The collecting of curios held out no inducement, and such scenery as had come under her notice she loudly declared was absurdly overrated. Later on, it was her ambition to climb Fujiyama, Nantai-san, Asama-yama, or any other mountain that might happen to come in her way, but as yet it was far too early in the year to think of such strenuous expeditions. Meanwhile, there were 2 or 3 sites which Lady Martinworth concluded were really worth her consideration. The game of polo, as it is played in Japan, the fencing and the wrestling matches. Over the description of the latter, she grew quite enthusiastic. The fact that these matches are not greatly patronized by the presence of ladies was alone sufficient to encourage Lady Martinworth in witnessing the performance as often as she could get a chance. She felt no disgust. On the contrary, she experienced intense admiration at the sight of these gigantic naked men, with their rolls of fat and their huge muscles standing out like cords, and at each fresh feat of strength, her enthusiasm increased. If all Japanese had been built on the same Herculean lines as the wrestlers, Lady Martinworth's admiration for the race would have been unbounded, but as it was for the natives, generally her ladyship expressed that contempt which, to say the least, is to be pitied as the outcome of ignorance and of an insular and uninquiring mind. She told Sir Ralph she could not see what there was in Japan to make such a fuss about. She launched into politics and prophesied complete annihilation if the country ever went to war with Russia. If the Japanese were as enlightened and advanced as was said, why on earth had not they made decent golf links in Tokyo? What could one think of a people who actually didn't know the meaning of the word sport in its everyday sense? As for their women, it was positively laughable to think of them as never taking any form of exercise, merely contesting themselves by driving in rickshaws with the hood up or in carriages that were closed. On very rare occasions, they did walk a few steps, she had been told. But then, was it not a dutiful and humble couple of yards behind the husband? Again, what possibly could be the charm of the Japanese woman for the European man was a mystery altogether, beyond her comprehension. A soft purring kitten of a creature who could only smile, acquiesce in everything, make gentle little phrases, and have pretty manners. Ralph ventured to remark that it was probably these very attributes, so unusual and so soothing, that proved their undoubted fascination and their charm. But at this assertion he was met with such a stony stare of amazement that he reddened. On the virtues and attractiveness of the Japanese woman, and the courage and perspicacity, and the cleverness and the far-seeing proclivities of the Japanese people generally, on which subjects Nicholson held the very strongest opinions. He, in all future discussions with Lady Martinworth, from henceforth held his peace. As an amusement, therefore, Lady Martinworth's bicycle proved almost her only resource. Even there she was doomed to a certain amount of disappointment, for she had not reckoned on the extreme variableness of the Japanese climate. It developed into a rainy spring. On certain days, the roads in and around Tokyo were practically impassable, and this inconvenience increased her contempt for a nation whose town municipality was certainly at that time permitted so completely to neglect its duties. A cloudless day, perfect in the brilliancy and clearness of its atmosphere, would, however, put a temporary stop to her grumblings, and seizing these rare opportunities and commanding Sir Ralph to accompany her, Lady Martinworth would promptly don her bloomers, straightway sallying forth on a bicycle ride of many miles. These expeditions, on the whole, suited Ralph's particular frame of mind, for they all took place before his engagement to Amy Mondovi. They would ride long distances without exchanging a word, which gave him plenty of time for reflection and for forming various projects and plans for the future, which, even at this time, he ventured to think might possibly prove not altogether so absolutely despairing and hopeless. While resting themselves at some chaya or tea-house, or while seated beneath the shade of a knoll of pines, or within the shadows of a bamboo grove, in the seclusion of which nestled many a picturesque Buddhist or Shinto shrine, Ralph would lay himself out to be agreeable to his companion. And indeed he found her capital company, and if the conversations did invariably turn on the subject of sport in some form or the other, he was all the better pleased. For Ralph was a keen sportsman, and in Harry Martinworth, whose love for all kinds of outdoor avocations was without affectation, and whose proficiency therein was indisputable, he found a genuine kindred spirit. It was during one of these expeditions that he happened to mention the fact of his friend Mrs. Nugent's illness. He had not forgotten the cherry party, nor the antagonistic and disdainful glances in which the ladies had indulged at the time, and consequently had so far purposely avoided bringing Pearl's name into their conversations. One day, however, when poor Pearl was at her very worst, he proved such a dull companion, so preoccupied, that Lady Martinworth's curiosity was aroused, and after some difficulty she succeeded in extracting the reason of his persistent and melancholy silence. To Ralph's surprise, his companion, on ascertaining the state of affairs, promptly turned her bicycle round, the only explanation she deigned to offer for this spasmodic movement being her intention of going forthwith to Mrs. Nugent's house to see what could be done for her. "But I was not aware that you were acquainted with her," was Ralph's remark as they raced along homewards. "Of course I know her. She is a dear friend of mine." "You don't suppose that I'm going to let her die, do you?" when I'm here on the spot and able to nurse her. Considering what he knew of the circumstances, it was perhaps not surprising that Nicholson would raise his eyebrows, smiling discreetly at what in this statement certainly somewhat savoured of exaggeration. Lady Martinworth did not, however, vouchsafe any further explanation, but remained silent for the rest of their journey home. True to her word, she bade adieu to Sir Ralph at the hotel, and cycled straight to Pearl's house, where she had considerable difficulty in making the boy understand, from her broken Japanese, her desire to see the patient, but finally succeeded in gaining admission to the drawing-room. She sent up her card, and after a certain length of time, Mrs. Rawlinson made her appearance. At the first glance, the two women proved antagonistic. Indeed, in Rosina's case, it was quite sufficient for a person to bear the detested name of Martinworth for her to buckle on her armour, acting at once on the defensive. "I have come to see Mrs. Nugent," said Lady Martinworth abruptly. "Will you be so good as to take me to her? I could not succeed in making that stupid servant understand that I wished to see her." "The boy was only obeying his orders," replied Mrs. Rawlinson brusquely, as her eyes travelled over the extraordinary figure before her. Lady Martinworth was still adorned in her cycling bloomers and with her cropped head, men's shirt, and motor cap. It was more difficult than ever to distinguish her from a member of the sterner sex. He was told not to allow anyone into the house. My cousin, Mrs. Nugent, is permitted to see no one. "But she sees you. Surely that is a totally different matter," replied Rosina coldly. "I am her cousin. My niece, Miss Mendovi, and I divide the nursing between us. Let me help you to nurse her. You may not know, Mrs. Rawlinson, but I am a certified nurse. Taking up nursing was a mere whim, but nevertheless I was for some time a nurse in the London hospital. Do let me undertake her case." Rosina softened. "It is very good of you to propose such a thing, Lady Martinworth, and I appreciate the kindness of heart that prompts you to make the offer. But we have an excellent trained Japanese nurse to help us, and I could not think of taking up your time. Besides, Rosina paused, as in spite of herself, her eyes once more became riveted on the bloomers. "Oh, well, of course I shouldn't dream of nursing her in this rig out, if that's what you mean by staring at my knickerbockers," exclaimed Lady Martinworth. "However, surely my garments are a mere matter of detail in such a question of vital importance. Let me be of some little use, Mrs. Rawlinson. Do let me assist in nursing your cousin. She has been very kind and good to me, and I have had so little kindness shown to me in my lifetime that I should like to do something to prove that I appreciate it, when it does happen to come in my way." Lady Martinworth's offer was, however, kindly but firmly declined. Rosina told Amy later that when she saw the look of disappointment that overshadowed the plain countenance, she found herself on the point of relenting. Perhaps, being naturally soft-hearted, she might have acceded in the end to Lady Martinworth's desire and have enlisted her aid. The incongruity of such a proceeding struck her, however, with particular force when she recalled to mind the former state of affairs between Mrs. Nugent and the lady's husband, and she remained firm in her refusal. The proposal offered so frankly and naturally, though declined, nevertheless won Mrs. Rawlinson's heart, and during the rest of the visit there was a marked change in her manner. They parted quite good friends, and though Lady Martinworth was not allowed to undertake the duties of nurse, she showed her desire to be useful and kind in many other ways. Every morning a large basket of flowers would arrive from the hotel. With Lady Martinworth's kind inquiries, and later on, during Pearl's convalescence, she would send every delicacy within the hotel's cook's capability, and her visits to the patient became, as time went on, more and more frequent. But at the period of Lady Martinworth's invasion, there was no question of convalescence, and for many days both Pearl's life and her reason hung in the balance. But at length she took a slight turn for the better. Her malady yielded to treatment, and her naturally strong constitution concurring in the end one day, shortly after Amy's engagement to Sir Ralph, she was pronounced by the physicians to be out of danger. It was, nevertheless, many, many weeks before Mrs. Nugent was allowed to be moved from her room. When at length she was lifted downstairs, absolute quiet and freedom from excitement were still prescribed. Indeed, the tranquillity insisted on appeared to be the culmination of Pearl's desires. She would lie on her sofa on the veranda, silent for hours, her eyes fixed on the beds of purple and snow-white irises bending their graceful heads in a gentle breeze, or on the distant view of Fujiyama, shadowy and dim in the hot June sun. It was only after many days that Rosina ventured to bring up Lady Martinworth's name and the eagerness of that lady to see her. At the mention of that name, which recalled so much that she would fain forget, Pearl half rose on her sofa, and the cheeks, now so thin and pale, flushed. "Is she alone?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes. Lord Martinworth is still away. He has been away for over 2 months now, since the day that you were taken ill." There was a pause as Pearl threw herself back wearily onto her cushions. "I cannot see her," she said at length. "I'm too weak. She is so jerky, so abrupt. She would fatigue me." Mrs. Rawlinson did not press the point, but she was not greatly surprised when some days later Pearl, after a long silence, quietly suggested that if Lady Martinworth called again, she would receive her. Henceforth commenced a series of visits which eventually proved of great pleasure and of a certain amount of profit to both women. Lord Martinworth's name was by tacit consent never mentioned, and when Pearl realized that no danger from that quarter was to be feared, she allowed herself to show genuine satisfaction at his wife's presence in her house. It must be confessed Lady Martinworth deserved considerable credit for the tact and cleverness she exhibited in amusing the invalid. Greatly as both Rosina and Amy might wonder at this strange and unexpected friendship, they could not but feel grateful for each smile which the visitor, with her quaint and caustic remarks, would succeed in conjuring up on the pale, sad face. But Lady Martinworth was not the only person admitted to Pearl's presence during this period of convalescence. De Güldenfeldt had returned from his travels at the very moment Mrs. Nugent's condition was considered the most critical, and he had hardly put foot in Tokyo before he was met with the news of her almost hopeless condition. This distressing information accomplished at one stroke what months of absence, of distraction, and of meditation had failed to do. Stanislas straightway forgot the fact that for long he had borne a bitter grudge against this woman, who had treated both him and his proposal with such calm and complete indifference. Not only all his love, but all his sympathies, all his fears for her safety, were aroused at this crushing news, and in spite of the accumulation of work awaiting him on his return, he found he could put his mind to nothing while Mrs. Nugent's fate hung in the balance. He haunted the house, sitting for hours in the drawing-room alone, or pacing the garden, till Amy or Rosina, taking pity on him, would steal a minute from their duties to inform him how the patient was progressing, or to give him the doctor's latest report. It was during this miserable period that Rosina guessed his secret. Indeed, a child could have read it, for it was easy enough to divine, and De Güldenfeldt himself made next to no attempt to disguise his feelings. One day, in a specially despairing mood, he went so far as to hint to Mrs. Rawlinson what had passed between him and Pearl. He found a sympathetic listener, and consequently ended by confiding all those cherished hopes which had met with so unexpected and so disastrous a termination. Like all large-hearted women, Rosina was somewhat of a matchmaker. At a glance, she saw the many advantages that Pearl had thrown away in this refusal of Stanislas de Güldenfeldt's love and protection. Promptly, she decided in her own mind that if her cousin should be spared, it would certainly not be her, Rosina Rawlinson's, fault, if matters were not one day brought to an entirely satisfactory conclusion. But now was not the time to think of such things. It was only later on, when Pearl was passing so many hours of enforced idleness on her sofa, that somehow it became a matter of course that Stanislas de Güldenfeldt should be found seated by her side, reading to her in his pleasant voice the latest books from Europe, or talking to her as only he could talk. That Pearl found pleasure in his society was evident. She seemed to forget that anything of a painful nature had ever passed between them. Her face would brighten as his form appeared on the veranda, and she would greet him gladly with her soft voice. De Güldenfeldt would often wonder whether in the very smallest degree she understood not only how blessed for him were those many hours spent thus by the side of her sofa, but likewise how intensely he dreaded the fatal moment when she would once more take up her everyday life, and when he consequently would necessarily be shifted to the conventional rank of the occasional afternoon visitor. But those dreaded days still seemed a long way off. Meanwhile, Stanislas de Güldenfeldt sat during the whole of those sweet summer afternoons in the presence of the woman he loved, drinking in the poison of her returning beauty, and dreaming dreams of untold happiness and content.